Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to answer the question, can you have a story which is not political? And the reason why I'm doing this is because my last video did fairly well. It was titled No Escapism Allowed, and it's almost up to 20,000 views, which is pretty good for my channel. But the thing is that when you get past that 15,000 view count, that's the time where it tends to bring out the crazies into the comments. And a lot of people in the comments were saying that I was claiming in that video that you can make stories apolitical. And they were using that term, apolitical. I don't say apolitical. I think apolitical is something different from not political, and I'll explain that in a little bit in this video. However, before I get to that, just a few housekeeping things. Number one, I will take that video, No Escapism Allowed, and link it in the description and at the end of this video if you want to go give it a listen. Number two, people have been asking me to put this back in. You can still get a copy of my book, Thomas Valiant, even though it is not on Indiegogo anymore. You can view the Indiegogo page to see what is available with it, but if you want a copy of the book, you just have to email me. My email is rjs4thage@gmail.com. Tell me where you want me to ship it so that I can calculate the shipping cost, and then we can go from there, and you can pay by PayPal and get a copy of my book. The other thing being, there's somebody who keeps on contacting me wanting a copy of my book. His name is Dr. Who. That's the only way I know him as. Yes, Dr. Who, I've been getting your emails. I've been responding to all of your emails. Please check your junk mail folder. And the last thing being that a lot of what I'm going to go over in this video has to do with language and language use and language origin. And funny enough, I just did an article for the Lotus Eaters website, which concentrated on that exact thing. And I'll link that in the description if anyone wants to go read that as well. So that out of the way, let's answer the question, can a story be non-political? And again, I'm using not political, not apolitical. That's something different. And since I'm not going to bury the lead, I'll tell you right up front. Here's how a story can be non-political. The people in the comments who accuse me of saying that a story can be apolitical say that basically everything is political, or at the very least, they use a definition of politics, which I certainly, and I would claim that most people, do not agree with. That's the simple fact of the matter. When you use the word political, people on the right, and I would say most people in the center as well, simply do not agree with you. Why? Because most of these people who say every story is political also use other terms, similar terms, which basically come down to everything is political. That is a left-wing stance, a quote-unquote progressive stance, and I would claim not a central left-wing stance either, a more radical left-wing stance. And if your definition of political goes back in any way to everything is political or almost everything is political, I do not agree with your definition of political. Why? Because it's not rational. And so, Western civilization does not agree with your definition of political, because there is a standard definition of political within Western civilization, and it's a rational definition. Sorry to speak in a way which sounds like I'm talking to a 2-year-old, but I'm trying to make it absolutely clear to the people on the other side of this argument. So, to ensure that I'm not straw-manning anyone, because I don't want to be accused of straw-manning anybody's position in saying they think that everything is political, let's look at this through the lens of a left-wing ideological standpoint. Let's look at story. How can you break down story? Think back to your, grade 6 English class. Stories are broken down into 3 different kinds. There is man versus man versus nature, and man versus himself. So let's look at the first one, man versus man. Now, it's easy to see how people might think that every man versus man story is political. Now, I agree, a man versus man story can be political, but I also think, and will argue later on in this video, that a man versus man story can be a personal story rather than a political story. However, in left-wing, quote-unquote, progressive circles, there is a slogan that they typically use that would eliminate this idea. And that slogan is, the personal is the political. And to back that up, let's go to a left-wing source, which is Wikipedia. It is definitely not on the right. And just look up this slogan just for a second to get a definition of it. It says, the personal is political, also termed the private is political is a political argument used as a rallying slogan of student movements and second-wave feminism from the late 1960s. In the context of the feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s, it was a challenge to the nuclear family and family values. The article goes on to talk about how women cannot transcend the fact that they are women, and how other groups must see this as well. And they include ethnicity, race, class, culture, marital status, sexuality, and ability or disability, and they encourage these individuals to think about personal experiences politically. And by the way, it talks about class, I think, 4 different times in this little article, and at the same time mentions oppression of women. I think it's at least 6 times again in this little article. Now you see where the entire thing is coming from. It's a class-based structure of persecution wherein the personal needs to be made the political because you're part of a certain class that you cannot transcend. And where does this come from and lead to? Well, it leads to conflating the idea of society with the political. Therefore, everything that is social is political. Therefore, every time you have 2 people interacting with each other, they're being social. Therefore, every one of these interactions is therefore political, even if it's personal. And therefore, all stories that involve more than one person, which is man versus man, is therefore political. Just to give a quick counterpoint to this, the conservative counterpoint, I would say, which I'm going to discuss later on in this video in more depth. But the thing is that as a conservative, we believe that yes, you can transcend those things, like being a woman, like your ethnicity, like your sexuality. You can transcend those things, and I can interact with other people because those are just accidents, not essential parts of the human being. And I can interact with another human being through those essential parts without the entire thing therefore being political. The second kind of story is man versus nature. Now, how in the world, many people would think to themselves, can they make man versus nature a political story? Well, it's because within movements that are connected to your quote-unquote progressive side of the scale, nature is political. I don't want to go too far in depth into this because I have in other videos, but this is replete throughout the entire left-wing movement over the last 100 years. If you look at something like the early days of the Soviet Union, where they had mass starvation. Why, in part, did they have mass starvation? Because the new farmers were told to plant crops in a socialist manner, that is to say, according to political norms, because they believed that even nature would respond to this political norm because even nature is political. This, of course, led to mass famine. Let's look at the 1993 movement started by Gorbachev, the former head of the Soviet Union, which had just collapsed, I think it was 2 years prior, because he wanted to keep the socialist system within place and he was defeated. What did he do? He started an environmentalist movement called the Green Cross, which, by the way, had tremendous impact upon the United Nations. And part of his agenda, which he stated, the first 2 things would be to A, draw up an ecological code of behavior, and B, propose international environmental laws and mechanisms to implement them. So, of course, if you're talking about a moral system of laws, what are you talking about? You're talking about something that's political. And so he's linking environmentalism with the political. Although I will discuss why this is not really a political system, according to a conservative and rational definition of what politics is later, tied to the fact that there is a constitution of nations rather than a constitution of citizens. But anyway, and you don't have to go very far today to see this very same mindset of Gorbachev that is alive and well. I was just Googling a few things, and I found an article from a place called socialist.net. By the way, the article is socialist.net. Climate change is political extinction rebellion. Of course, they're talking about the movement of Extinction Rebellion, and they're saying the following. The problem is climate change is political. It's a class question. It is the capitalists and their system that are responsible for destroying the planet. It is the rich elite who are responsible for the lion's share of pollution and waste. So if you're wondering why you have all of these politicians who think they can affect the world system of the environment and how the climate works through implementing taxes or a Green New Deal or all of these other policies, well, it's because at the heart of this movement and way of thinking is that the environment itself is connected directly to the political. Therefore, doing political things can affect the environment directly, and therefore they can, quote unquote, save the planet. And for a second, let's just go back to Wikipedia and talk about environmental politics. What does it say? Well, it says there is a distinguishing mark between the modern and earlier forms of environmental politics. In particular, conservationism and preservationism. Contemporary environmental politics, quote, was driven by the idea of a global ecological crisis that threatens the very existence of humanity, unquote, and, quote, modern environmentalism was a political and activist mass movement which demands a radical transformation in the values and structures of society. Again, because they link the environment with the political. But the entire point being, man versus nature is a political story to these people. Why? Because nature is political. And the third kind of story is man versus himself. And again, people are saying to themselves, how in the world can you make that political? Well, it's because of internal oppression. You see, when a person versus themselves, it's because there's internal oppression upon that person. And where does this internalized oppression come from? Well, it comes from the political. Let's go back once again to Wikipedia and the causes of internalized oppression. It says internalized oppression occurs when a person comes to legitimize oppressive prejudice and biases about the identity groups to which he or she belongs. It occurs when social oppression such as racism, sexism, ableism, classism, heterosexualism, gender and religious oppression, and anti-Semitism are implanted by the work towards the benefit of any dominant group. Internalized oppression depends upon systematically limiting, blocking, and undermining the success, innovation, and power of oppressed individuals or groups. By the way, I love how they put classism in the middle of all of this list of things when they're talking about identifiable groups, which, by the way, if you're an identifiable group, you're called a class. Therefore, it's all classism. And by the way, you can trace this entire thing back to the postmodernists, most specifically Foucault, who was basically a socialist and wanted to find a way of expressing in a French term how socialism and communism could work for modern society. And he talks all about how internalized oppression began because of the class struggle and people being taught in a societal and political way that, yes, you must repress parts of yourself because you are being dominated and oppressed through an upper class. So yes, a story about a man versus himself is political because it all traces itself back to oppression, and that oppression comes from different classes, and that interaction of those societal classes, again, conflating the idea of societal with political, therefore makes the entire thing political. And here's just a fun little note off of all of that. If you go to Wikipedia and look up internalized oppression, the first thing you see is that it is a part of social justice theory. You click on that hyperlink and it goes to social justice theory. And what is social justice theory? Well, it's included under a group of articles on green politics. And if you go to green politics, what does it talk about? Well, green politics talks about feminism. And again, if you click on that hyperlink to feminism, it brings you back to the personal is the political. I just wanted to say that to give you a little notion of how these things are all interconnected. So, 2 points before I move on. Number one, someone in the comments, I'm sure, is going to say, but you didn't cover this, and you didn't cover that, and it's still the straw man, because you're not including every last thing that defines what everybody redefines and defines as political within your quote-unquote progressive movement every time it changes. No, I haven't. I don't have to. Why? Because if you deal with things rationally, I'm dealing with the broader aspects of all of this and where it comes from. So I'm touching on the fundamental principles that underlie this entire strain of thought. And you've probably seen it comes from a socialist mindset of oppressor and oppression, of class warfare, and an entire system that has been proven time and again not to be rational. And one of the earmarks of that is to make everything political, when not everything is political. Because if everything is political, what you're defining is just the universe. Therefore, yes, you can have a story that is not political. Why? Because I don't accept your definition of what political is. I use the rational definition of political. By the way, I should also mention at this point, you see that these strains of thought where they think everything is political, they would say that every story is political, and therefore the content of every story is also political as well, because it's expressing what the larger structure of the story is trying to say. But in a conservative way of thinking, when you reject that kind of idea that everything is political, then I can have a story which is a political story which does not discuss politics within its content, and vice versa, I can have a story which has content about politics, which is not political. But let's move on to the conservative idea of what political is, and the rational idea of where it comes from, and see how that is tied in with a story. Now, if you look at politics, according to logic, and logic itself, which was developed in the best form that we know of, which, by the way, yes, I use classical logic. Why? Because I don't believe in modern logic, which is just game theory, which says that you can basically have a circuit board of ideas which are independent of what reality actually is. No, you have to include reality in logic. And the person who brought forth the system of logic, that, again, by the way, is the supporting idea and supporting thinker of most of the intellectual movement of the entire Western world, is Aristotle. And Aristotle talking about logic. What is logic? Well, it's the rules of reason applied to reason itself. And in a logical way, what is politics? Well, politics is a subset of moral philosophy and is sometimes called public morals. Why? Because there's different subsections of moral philosophy. They would be the personal, which is also called ethics. There is the economic, and then there is the political, which is public morals, as opposed to personal morals, which is ethics. And before I get any further, I suppose I should go into the etymology of the word itself. And yes, I know my pronunciation of Greek is terrible. You can put that in the comments if you want. But it comes from the Greek polis, which derives itself from the word of a citizen. By the way, citizen is very important in this because citizen denotes it has to do with something which is constitutional. If you don't have a constitution, if you have a tyranny, you're not a citizen, you're a subject. Therefore, in order to have political, you need to talk about citizens with their connection to a constitution that actually grants them citizenship, which, by the way, feeds into the modern definitions of what political is, because if you look at modern definitions of political in dictionaries that have not been changed because of one fad or another, and this is what I do because I have a collection of old dictionaries, you'll see that the idea of the political is always tied to a large governmental structure, not a small governmental structure. Why? Because it is tied to a governmental structure that has a constitution. But going back to the logical subsection of what politics is, being part of moral philosophy, let's look at that just for a second. Because a lot of people think to themselves when they listen to these quote-unquote progressive people, why do they have to be such moral nags? Why do they have to take everything and make it a moral issue? Why? Because to them, everything is political. And what is politics? Politics is public morals. Now, they won't admit that, but they understand that fact. And so they understand, and they know at some level that they are trying to make everything about public morals. So what they really mean by everything is political is that everything is moral and we have the correct moral stance. Which, by the way, is irrational in itself, because if you look at socialist governments all over the world, they end up being dictatorships, not constitutional republics or anything of the kind, whereas people cease being citizens and become subjects, and therefore it's not political anymore. And this is the very nature of socialism, that the individual does not matter as much as the society. You look at the good of the society, and if you do that, again, you cut off these people from being real citizens, which are granted citizenship through a constitution. Because what good is a constitution if the government can change it willy-nilly whenever they like and has ultimate control not only to change it, but to violate it whenever they want? That's just a dictatorship. Now, here's where we get into the sticky bits. Aristotle, the person who laid all of this down 2,400 years ago, also talked a lot about storytelling. And when he talks about storytelling, he talks about the fable of a story, also translated and called the moral of the story. And here's the thing. Can you have a story that doesn't have a moral? Well, no, you can't. Why? Because the moral or the fable of the story is also called the plot of the story. And the thing being that a story, again, going back to Aristotle and the way that Western civilization has followed him throughout its course and how he talks about the structure of a story, you need to have something more than a random series of events. If you don't have a plot, all you have is a random series of events. So much so that your plot also will not work if you have unconnected things which are placed in a bad order. That is to say, things need to follow A, B, C, D. You can't have something within your plot that goes A, D, B, C. That makes a bad plot, and at the very least a bad story, if not removing what you're making from the element of storytelling itself. Now, there's a lot of other interconnected things in that as well. If you want to go back and read Aristotle's Poetics, it's a very short book. You can find all of that within that very short book. But the point being that in order for it to be a story, it has to have a very specific structure. This very specific structure makes up a linear and proportional series of events that are connected together, which those things make up the plot. The plot is also called the moral of the story, and therefore, if you have a correct story, you have something that is based upon morality. Even if it's just something as simple as your story is correctly told, therefore it's done proportionally, and proportionally means beautiful in the ancient sense of the word, and since you're calling it beautiful, you're putting a value on it, and therefore that's a moral value that you're putting on the definition of beauty, and therefore the story. And I could go on all day about this, but I'll stop there. But the point being, even though politics is public morals, that does not mean that every story is political. Why? Because it's a logical fallacy to say that everything that is political is moral, therefore everything moral is political. It doesn't work that way. I think it's a logical fallacy of affirming the consequent. It doesn't necessarily follow. Just because all horses are mammals doesn't mean all mammals are horses. So yes, if you have a moral element to a story, which you must have to have a proper plot, then you can have political stories. That is certain. But not all stories are political because not all stories fall under public morals. You can have one of the other subsections of moral philosophy, which would be either ethics, which is private morals, or even economics. I've seen stories written upon economics, trust me. And here's where I get to the small point of why I do not use the term apolitical. Why? Because if politics is public morality, then you're saying you can make a story which is amoral. No, you can't. A story, in order to have a plot, is also called the moral of the story. Therefore, you cannot have a amoral story. Those two things, logically and rationally, according to reason that is subject to reason itself, do not follow. Now, let's move on to the last form of this question that I got in the comments. People saying, well, you're talking about political correctness, but you're talking about left-wing political correctness. And all you're doing is saying that right-wing political correctness is what you want, and therefore you need to change it from one to the other. So they're saying every story is political, and I'm just asking for politically right-wing stories instead of politically left-wing stories. No, that doesn't follow from the very definitions of how both sides defines politics. Now, I'll try to get through this with some speed, but the point is that on the right, and what Western civilization has done for the last, at least 2,500 years, is to try and base the political on what is called natural law. Now, what is natural law? Well, basically, natural law is how does a human being become fulfilled? And when you take those things which constitute the fulfillment of a human being, by the way, both as an individual and part of a society, then you'll see that those things that follow from it are part of natural law. Those statements of natural law are what all of our laws and all of our institutions for, at the very least, 2,000 years that created Western civilization have been applied to. If you look at something like the great American experiment itself, it's a natural law experiment. It's basing itself upon natural law. Its statement about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a natural law statement. Why? Well, first of all, you have to have life, because if you don't have life, you don't have anything else. Second of all, you must have liberty, because if you don't have liberty, you can't do anything by yourself after that point. And thirdly, what do you do with that life and that liberty? Well, you pursue human happiness. And what is another way of saying human happiness? Well, it's human fulfillment. Therefore, the pursuit of happiness is quite literally, as I have stated, a statement of natural law. And yes, we can understand what the fulfillment of a human being looks like because, again, this is what Western civilization has been struggling with for at least 2,500 years. And yes, we've made a little bit of progress in that subject matter. So what would be an example of natural law? Well, a statement of law, which is based upon natural law, would be something like, you can't murder other individuals. That's based directly on natural law, just like that statement of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. First, you have to have life. You see, that is one of the key necessary elements to getting to human fulfillment. Therefore, if it is, then it is part of the natural law that you don't willy-nilly kill other people. Therefore, we can make actual laws based upon the fact that you don't kill each other. And by the way, our entire law system is based upon natural law. People are looking around them today and wondering why laws are so messed up, why the law system doesn't work. It's because the people in charge right now don't believe in natural law, and therefore they're subverting the very meaning of how all our laws work and the law systems that created them and underlie their working mechanisms. Therefore, since they don't acknowledge that, things are not working correctly. And I suppose I should stick this in here because I always do, just to make people a little more comfortable. Yes, it seems that the majority of people who are natural law theorists, who study natural law, are indeed theists. But not all of them. There are some high-profile atheists who believe in natural law as well. So no, you don't have to be a theist or a religious person in order to believe in natural law. And there's 2 points that I want to draw out of this, one small and one large. The small one is that, yes, even those little laws, something like a traffic law, that's supposed to be dependent, traced back to something which is coming from natural law. If it doesn't, it's an unjust law. So to say something like, you shouldn't go any faster than this miles per hour on this road, or you're going to get fined, and we've made some laws to state that, which comes through the political mechanism. Why? Because again, there's many factors, but at its heart, it would be life is what is needed in order to get human fulfillment. You can't do willy-nilly things with your life, or quite specifically with the lives of others. Therefore, we have to put some restrictions in there. Now, you can argue about those smaller laws, and you can move them around and make them conform with the circumstances that you're in, but it doesn't change the fact that they're still based upon natural law in some way. They trace it back, as you trace things back, logically and rationally. And the larger thing is something that you may have picked up on. It's the fact that you see these socialist people. They're trying to institute what is basically modern tyranny. Therefore, what they're doing is using political systems to destroy political systems in order to institute something which is not political. It's not political because they don't want a constitution. They don't want a constitution because individuals can't have rights which are granted by a constitution which allow them to hold the society and central power in check. But that's the whole point of depending things upon natural law, because natural law is looking for human fulfillment first as an individual and then as a society. That's why it feeds into constitutional republics, because a constitution grants to its citizens some rights which they believe are necessary for their human fulfillment, and therefore you have a system of politics. But the whole point being that no, it's not me using a system of I'm going to beat you over the head with a stick with my conservative values, and that's all I'm trying to do by putting in conservative so-called political correctness because I'm on the other side. Not at all. That's your side. That's the progressive side of the scale. That is the far leftist and socialist side of the scale. They have nothing more than I have power, therefore I'm beating you over the head with this power. Why? Because it all comes back to, again, a class struggle, which is oppressor and oppressed. If you want to turn the tables on your oppressor, you have to have more power than they do. Therefore, it all comes down to power. In a conservative worldview, which is dependent upon something rational and logical, that's not where things come from. That's not where the political comes from. Therefore, I'm not just trying to turn the tables and use the left-wing policies in my own political way. because what I'm talking about is everything that is dependent upon natural law. It is a rational system which takes into account what reality is around us, how people interact with reality around us, and how the human experience is directed towards some kind of fulfillment within that reality. And by the way, if you're wondering why I'm getting all hot and bothered about this and why I'm ranting a little bit about this, is because I find this an absurd question. And these people who believe that everything, and certainly every story, is political, also believe that a hero is something that is political. That's what your hero is supposed to be in a story if every story is political. He's the so-called moral example of how to act politically in the way that expresses the system, where again it all traces back to oppressor and oppressed and a class struggle. That's all a hero is in the eyes of these people. And that's what this quote-unquote new hero that you see within all of these movies, television shows, games is based upon. It's a subtle, sometimes not so subtle, moral nag that is telling you that morally we have the right stance. This is the moral right stance as expressed by the fact that we call this person a hero, and therefore you should follow this moral stance and act politically in this way. But I would like to do an entire video about that, and therefore, since this video is a little too long already, I'm going to stop there. But the point being, yes, you can have a story that is not political. Why? Because, as I said at the first, to repeat myself, I do not agree with the definition of what a left-wing, quote-unquote, progressive person identifies as political. The systems whereby we live in Western civilization do not agree with the progressive definition of political. The etymology of the word does not agree with their definition of political. Rationality itself does not agree with their definition of political. Their definition goes back to everything is political, therefore every story is included in everything, therefore every story is political. As a conservative, I reject that. I say yes, a story can be political because politics is public morals, but every story does not need to be political because there are other forms of moral philosophy, economic and personal. And even if we have to have a story, again, which has a moral because that's the plot of the story, not every story needs to be political. And so my ultimate answer to those people who keep going in my comments and saying, no story can be non-political, is to say to them, well, first off, you're trying to argue with me. Argument is a rational and logical tool, but at the same time, you're not being rational and logical. Why? Because true logic, which is applying the rules of reason to reason itself, derives its origin from reality. That's how logic and reason work. And therefore, if you argue with me, you will lose. Why? Well, not because I'm such a smart guy, but because what you're arguing with ultimately is not me, but is reality itself. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And again, just a reminder, if you wish to order my graphic novel, just send me an email. My email is linked down there in the description. And also, if you want to go over and read that article, which I wrote for lotuseaters.com, the link for that is over in the description as well. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.